Some mountains don't hide gold, the old traders used to say. They hide stories that refuse to die. The wind moved slowly through Red Mesa Canyon that evening, carrying the dry scent of dust, sage, and sun-warmed stone. The light of the setting sun stretched long shadows across the cliffs, turning the red rock walls into towering pillars of fire. Ethan Caldwell guided his bay horse down the narrow trail, the leather saddle creaking softly with each careful step. He had been riding for nearly 12 miles since noon, following a faint map sketched by a half-blind prospector in a saloon 2 towns back. According to that man, something ancient rested somewhere inside this canyon. Not gold, not silver, something older. Ethan didn't know if the man had been telling the truth or chasing ghosts, but curiosity had a way of pulling a rider farther than good sense sometimes allowed. The trail bent sharply between 2 massive stone walls, barely wide enough for a wagon, and the air grew cooler as the sun sank behind the cliffs. Ethan leaned forward slightly in the saddle, studying the ground ahead. The canyon was too quiet. No birds, no rustling brush, just wind sliding across rock like a slow breath. His horse suddenly stopped. The animal's ears lifted forward, and its muscles tightened beneath the saddle. Ethan followed the horse's gaze upward. A figure stood on a ledge about 20 feet above the trail, perfectly still against the burning sky. She held a bow in one hand, not raised, not threatening, simply resting like it belonged there. Her dark hair moved lightly in the wind, and the turquoise beads around her neck caught the last streaks of sunlight. Her voice came down calm and clear. "Turn around, cowboy." Ethan blinked once, surprised not by the words, but by the quiet certainty behind them. He rested a hand on the saddle horn and tilted his hat back slightly, so he could see her better. She looked young, maybe 20, but the way she stood carried the steady confidence of someone who knew every inch of this land. "You're a long way from town," Ethan said, his voice easy. The woman didn't smile. Her eyes moved briefly to the canyon walls, then back to him. "This canyon is not for you," she said. "Leave before the mountain wakes." The words hung in the air like a riddle carried by the wind. Ethan glanced around the silent cliffs, then back at her. "Mountain looks asleep to me." For a moment neither of them moved. The sun slid lower behind the cliffs, painting the canyon floor in deep copper light. The woman studied him carefully, as if measuring something she couldn't see. "Men have come here before," she said. None of them listened. Ethan shrugged lightly in the saddle. Maybe they didn't hear the right warning. The woman stepped closer to the edge of the ledge, her shadow stretching down the rock face toward him. "This place protects its own stories," she said quietly. "It does not welcome strangers." Ethan looked past her toward the winding canyon ahead. Something about the stillness of the place made the air feel older than the map in his pocket. Slowly, he nudged the reins forward. The horse took one cautious step, then another. Above him, the Apache girl watched in silence. And for the first time since he entered Red Mesa Canyon, the wind stopped completely. The hoofbeats sounded louder now, each step echoing against the tall canyon walls like a slow drum. Ethan Caldwell kept his reins loose but steady, letting the bay horse choose its footing along the narrow trail. Above him, the Apache girl moved along the ridge with quiet ease, keeping pace without hurry. She stepped from one rock to another, as if the canyon itself had taught her where to place her feet. For a while neither of them spoke. The air felt heavier the deeper the trail bent into Red Mesa Canyon. The sunlight faded behind the cliffs until only a narrow ribbon of pale gold touched the upper edges of the stone. Ethan finally looked up toward her again. "Do you follow every traveler who rides through here?" he asked calmly. "Or am I special?" The girl did not answer immediately. She studied the ground ahead, then the distant bend in the canyon, as if listening to something older than their conversation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried down the rock walls with steady patience. "You are the only traveler today." Ethan nodded slowly. "That is good news for my horse. He does not enjoy crowded trails." The girl stopped walking. She crouched slightly on the ledge and rested her bow against her shoulder. The fading light revealed more of her face. Now, calm but serious, the kind of expression that belonged to someone who had grown up hearing stories most people never believed. "You think this is a trail?" she said quietly. "It is not. It is a boundary." Ethan slowed the horse and glanced ahead again. The path narrowed even more between two enormous slabs of stone that leaned toward each other like old gateposts. Beyond them the canyon curved out of sight. A boundary to what? He asked. The girl did not answer right away. Instead she climbed down from the ledge with careful steps, using small handholds carved naturally into the rock. Within moments she stood on the trail about 10 feet ahead of him. Up close the turquoise beads around her neck caught the dim light of the sky. She placed one hand gently against the canyon wall. Our elders say the mountain remembers everything, she said. The footsteps of hunters, the prayers of healers, even the mistakes of strangers. Ethan watched her quietly. The horse shifted its weight, but did not move forward. Sounds like the mountain has a long memory, he said. The girl nodded slightly. Long enough to protect what is hidden here. Ethan leaned forward in the saddle, studying her expression. You mentioned men who came here before, he said. What were they looking for? The girl looked toward the narrow passage ahead, where the trail vanished between shadowed cliffs. The wind returned then, sliding through the canyon with a soft, hollow sound. The wrong thing, she answered. Ethan considered that for a moment. Then he reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded map the old prospector had given him. He unfolded the worn paper against the saddle horn. The girl watched silently as he studied it. After a moment, Ethan looked back at her. According to this, he said calmly, there is something important beyond those rocks. The girl's eyes moved from the map to the turquoise stone resting against Ethan's chest. For the first time her expression changed. Not fear, not anger, something closer to recognition. She took one slow step forward. Where did you get that stone? She asked. Ethan glanced down at the small turquoise amulet hanging from a leather cord around his neck. He touched it lightly with his fingers. My mother gave it to me, he said. The girl's gaze did not move. From the stone, the wind moved softly through the canyon again, and this time the silence between them felt deeper than before. The wind moved again through the canyon, softer now, carrying the faint scent of dry stone and distant sage. Ethan Caldwell let the map rest against the saddle horn while his fingers still touched the turquoise amulet at his chest. The Apache girl had not taken her eyes off it. For a long moment, she said nothing, and the quiet between them stretched across the narrow canyon trail like something waiting to be understood. Ethan finally lowered his hand from the stone. My mother wore it first, he said calmly. She gave it to me before she passed away. The girl studied his face as if weighing the truth of the words against memories older than either of them. Your mother, she said slowly. Did she ever speak about this place? Ethan shook his head once. She spoke about many places, he answered, but never this canyon. The girl turned slightly and looked toward the narrow passage ahead where the two towering slabs of stone leaned together like a doorway carved by time itself. The fading light barely reached beyond them now. Shadows gathered there, thick and cool. That stone, she said quietly, belongs to a story our elders tell beside winter fires. Ethan watched her carefully. What kind of story? The girl looked back at him. The kind that does not forget. For a moment Ethan considered her words. Then he folded the old map and placed it back inside his coat pocket. You said this trail is a boundary, he said. Maybe it is time someone explained what stands on the other side. The girl stepped closer to the canyon wall again, running her fingertips lightly across the red stone as if greeting an old friend. Not everyone who crosses this place comes back understanding what they found, she said. Ethan gave a faint smile beneath the brim of his hat. That sounds like most trails in the West. The girl almost smiled at that, though the expression disappeared as quickly as it came. She walked toward the narrow opening between the giant rocks and stopped there, turning halfway toward him. The horse shifted nervously, but Ethan kept the reins steady. If you ride through there, she said quietly, you do not ride as a stranger. Anymore. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. That sounds serious. The girl nodded. Because it is. She looked again at the turquoise stone resting against his chest. The color of it glowed softly in the dim canyon light. My name is Ayanna, she said after a moment. Ethan tipped his hat slightly. Ethan Caldwell. Ayanna turned back toward the shadowed passage. For several seconds, she stood listening to the wind moving deeper inside the canyon. The air felt cooler there, as if the earth itself held its breath beyond the stone gate. Finally she spoke again, her voice quieter now but certain. If your mother gave you that stone, she said, then you deserve to see what waits beyond this boundary. Ethan leaned forward slightly in the saddle. That sounds like permission. Ayana shook her head gently. No, she said. It is a test. She stepped into the narrow opening between the towering rocks, disappearing partly into the shadow. Then she glanced back over her shoulder. Follow me carefully, Ethan Caldwell, she said. The path ahead does not forgive careless footsteps. Ethan nudged the horse forward slowly. The hooves stepped between the two giant slabs of stone. Behind them, the last light of evening faded from the canyon walls. Ahead, the hidden path of Red Mesa Canyon began to reveal itself. The space beyond the stone gate felt different the moment Ethan Caldwell rode through it. The air cooled by several degrees, carrying a quiet stillness that the outer canyon had not held. The narrow path twisted between high rock walls that rose nearly 60 feet on either side, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind and desert storms. Ayana walked ahead with steady confidence, her steps silent on the dusty ground, while Ethan guided his horse slowly behind her. The animal moved carefully, lowering its head as if sensing that the trail demanded patience. The last streaks of sunset faded above the canyon rim, leaving the passage painted in deep amber shadows. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The sound of the horse's hooves echoed softly against the stone while a faint breeze moved through the narrow corridor like a distant whisper. Ethan studied the path as they went deeper. The ground here was different. Small flat stones had been arranged carefully along the trail, not in straight lines, but in a subtle pattern that kept the footing firm between patches of loose sand. This path was built, he said quietly after a moment. Ayana did not turn around, but her voice answered from a few steps ahead. Long before my people guarded this canyon. Ethan leaned slightly in the saddle, examining the stonework more closely. So someone else knew about this place. Ayana slowed and placed one hand against the canyon wall. Many people once knew, she said. But knowing and understanding are not the same thing. The path curved gently to the left, revealing a wider chamber in the canyon where the rock walls opened into a natural circle nearly 80 feet across. Ethan drew the horse to a stop. The walls of this hidden space were covered with carvings etched deep into the red stone. Spirals, animal shapes, and symbols stretched across the surface like a silent story waiting to be read. The fading evening light caught the edges of the carvings and turned them pale gold against the darker rock. Ethan stared at them with quiet fascination. That was not done recently, he said. Ayana turned to face him now. Some of these carvings are older than the oldest memory of my tribe. Ethan slowly slid from the saddle and stepped closer to the stone wall. His boots stirred the fine red dust beneath his feet. He reached out and ran his fingers gently across one of the carved spirals. The grooves were deep and smooth from centuries of wind passing through the canyon. Ayana watched him carefully. Our elders say this chamber is where the first healers learned to listen, she said softly. Ethan looked back at her. Listen to what? Ayana lifted her chin slightly toward the towering walls surrounding them. To the land. Ethan gave a thoughtful nod and continued studying the carvings. One symbol near the center of the wall caught his attention. It was different from the others. A circle carved around a small shape that looked almost like a stone pendant. His hand moved instinctively toward the turquoise amulet hanging from his neck. Ayana noticed the movement immediately. She stepped closer to the wall and touched the carved circle with the tips of her fingers. This symbol appears in many stories, she said quietly. Ethan looked from the carving to the turquoise stone resting against his chest. It looks familiar, he admitted. Ayana studied the amulet again, the same expression of recognition returning to her eyes. Yes, she said softly. It does. The wind slipped down into the hidden chamber then, moving gently across the carved stone walls as if the canyon itself had begun to breathe again. The wind moved slowly across the carved chamber, brushing the ancient stone walls like a quiet hand turning the pages of an old book. Ethan Caldwell stood beside the carvings, his fingers still resting near the spiral symbol that matched the shape surrounding the turquoise stone on his chest. For a moment he did not speak. The silence inside the chamber felt deeper than the canyon outside, as if the place itself listened to every word that might be spoken here. Ayana stepped closer to the wall and traced the carved circle again, her fingertips moving with quiet familiarity. This symbol marks the stories of the healers, she said softly. Ethan glanced back at her. You mentioned healers earlier. Ayana nodded once. Long ago, before the tribes divided the desert into territories, there were people who traveled between them. They carried knowledge instead of weapons. They learned the plants that could ease pain, the springs that could save travelers in the heat, and the words that calmed frightened hearts. Ethan listened carefully while the wind moved faintly through the open circle of stone above them. Your elders still tell these stories, he said. Yes, Ayana replied. But the stories are not only about our people. Ethan looked again at the carved symbol. The turquoise amulet rested quietly against his shirt, catching the last glow of evening light drifting down from the canyon rim nearly 80 feet above. Then whose story is it? He asked. Ayana hesitated for a moment before answering. It is the story of a stranger who came from far away and chose kindness when he could have chosen fear. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. That sounds like the beginning of a legend. Ayana gave a small nod. It became one. She stepped away from the wall and walked slowly across the chamber floor until she reached a flat stone set into the center of the circle. The stone looked different from the surrounding ground. Its surface had been polished smooth by countless years of careful hands resting upon it. Ayana placed her palm gently against it and continued speaking. The elders say the stranger arrived many seasons ago when drought covered the desert. Our people had lost several springs, and many believe the canyon spirits had turned away from us. Ethan leaned lightly against the saddle of his horse, listening, and the stranger helped them find water. Ayana looked up at him. Not only water. He helped them remember how to listen to the land again. Ethan glanced down at the turquoise amulet resting against his chest. Something about the story stirred a faint memory in the back of his mind. My mother used to talk about the desert like that, he said quietly. Ayana's gaze sharpened slightly. What did she say? Ethan thought for a moment before answering. She said the land always speaks first. People only get lost when they stop paying attention. The words hung in the chamber like a quiet echo. Ayana studied his face carefully, then looked again at the turquoise stone around his neck. That is exactly what the healers used to say, she whispered. Ethan frowned slightly in thought. You believe my mother knew these stories? Ayana did not answer right away. Instead, she walked back toward the carved wall and rested her hand once more on the circle surrounding the symbol. I believe, she said slowly, that the story we tell about the stranger may not be finished yet. Ethan felt the cool desert breeze drift through the chamber again, carrying a quiet sense that the canyon itself had been waiting a long time for someone to return. The quiet inside the hidden chamber lingered long after Ayana's words faded into the stone walls. Ethan Caldwell remained beside his horse, his eyes moving slowly across the carvings as if trying to read something written far beyond the shapes themselves. The evening light above the canyon rim had grown dimmer now, leaving the chamber painted in deep rust-colored shadows. The turquoise amulet rested against his chest, cool against the desert air. For several moments neither of them spoke. Then Ethan finally broke the silence. You said the story might not be finished, he said calmly. Ayana looked toward the narrow path that had led them into the chamber. Her posture shifted slightly, the quiet confidence in her stance now mixed with something more alert. The stories of this canyon never end quietly, she replied. Ethan noticed the change in her tone. Something else is coming. Ayana nodded slowly. Not tonight perhaps, but soon. She walked toward the edge of the circular chamber where the trail continued deeper into the canyon. From there the path descended gradually between taller rock formations, their jagged silhouettes rising nearly 100 feet toward the fading sky. Ethan followed her gaze. You are expecting visitors. Ayana did not turn around. I am expecting trouble that does not understand what this place protects. Ethan crossed his arms lightly across the saddle horn and considered her words. Gold hunters, he said after a moment. Ayana glanced back at him, surprised. How did you know? Ethan shrugged slightly. Every rumor I heard in the last town talked about lost silver veins somewhere in these mesas. He gestured loosely toward the canyon walls. Whenever men believe there is treasure hidden in rock, they tend to start digging first and asking questions later. Ayana's expression grew more serious. The treasure they imagined does not exist here. Ethan looked again at the carvings along the stone walls. But something valuable does. Ayana nodded once. Yes. She stepped toward a narrow opening in the far side of the chamber, where a faint path curved downward into shadow. Beyond this chamber the canyon splits into 3 valleys, she explained. Two of them are empty stone and dry wind. The third leads to a place our people protect. Ethan studied the path she indicated. The darkness beyond it felt deeper than the rest of the canyon, as if the land itself guarded the secret beyond that turn. Let me guess, he said quietly. That is the place the treasure hunters will eventually find. Ayana's gaze returned to the turquoise amulet around his neck. Unless someone stops them before they understand what they are touching. Ethan let out a slow breath and looked up toward the narrow strip of twilight sky above the canyon walls. You brought me here because of this stone, he said. Ayana nodded again. Our stories say the friend of the healer carried a stone like that. Ethan tilted his head slightly. And what did the friend do? Ayana met his eyes. He stayed when others would have ridden away. The wind drifted gently through the chamber again, stirring the dust across the ancient floor. Ethan looked down at the turquoise amulet resting against his chest, then back toward the shadowed trail leading deeper into the canyon. Somewhere beyond those dark bends lay the place Ayana's people had protected for generations. And somewhere far beyond the canyon walls, men who believed only in silver and stone were already beginning to search for it. The fading light above the canyon rim slipped slowly into deep blue as evening settled over Red Mesa. The hidden chamber felt quieter now, as if the land itself had begun listening more closely to every movement within its stone walls. Ethan Caldwell rested one hand on the saddle horn while studying the narrow trail that curved downward beyond the chamber. The path was barely wide enough for a single rider, winding between tall rock formations that leaned together like silent guardians. Ayana stepped toward the opening and paused there, her eyes scanning the darkening canyon ahead. The wind carried a faint sound from somewhere far beyond the rocks. It was subtle, almost too distant to notice. But Ethan heard it. He lifted his head slightly. Horses, he said quietly. Ayana did not turn around. Yes. The word came calm, but certain. Ethan walked a few steps forward until he stood beside her. From this angle the canyon opened just enough to reveal a long stretch of desert sky above the cliffs. The stars had begun appearing one by one, pale and steady in the deepening dusk. How far away do you think they are? He asked. Ayana tilted her head slightly as she listened to the faint rhythm drifting through the canyon wind. At least 2 miles, she said. But they are following the lower wash. By morning they will reach the outer canyon. Ethan nodded slowly. Then the rumors reached them faster than I expected. Ayana turned toward him now, studying his face carefully. You knew others might come here. Ethan gave a small shrug. I knew men in the last town were asking questions about lost silver veins somewhere in these mesas. He glanced back toward the chamber walls covered with ancient carvings. But I do not think silver is what they will find. Ayana's expression remained calm, though her eyes carried a quiet resolve. If they reach the inner valley, they will try to claim it. Ethan leaned slightly against the canyon wall, crossing his arms as he thought. The cool stone pressed through his shirt, grounding him in the quiet weight of the place. How many riders do you expect? He asked. 5. Ayana answered without hesitation. Perhaps 6. Ethan raised one eyebrow. You listen to the ground that closely. Ayana gave a faint smile. The land always speaks first. For a moment, they both stood silently at the edge of the trail while the distant sound faded again into the desert night. Then Ayana stepped back into the chamber and moved toward the polished stone in its center. She rested her hand on its smooth surface once more. Beyond that trail, she said softly, the canyon opens into the valley where the healers once gathered. Ethan followed her gaze. The place your people protect. Ayana nodded. Yes. Ethan glanced down at the turquoise amulet resting against his chest. The stone seemed darker now beneath the evening sky. And you believe I came here because of this? Ayana looked directly at him. I believe the canyon brought you here. Ethan considered that answer for a moment, then looked back toward the narrow trail, descending into shadow. Somewhere beyond those turns lay the valley Ayana had described, hidden from the outside world for generations. Somewhere behind them, riders who believed only in silver and stone were slowly making their way toward the canyon. Ethan let out a slow breath and adjusted the reins loosely in his hand. Then I suppose we should see what this valley looks like before morning arrives. Ayana studied him carefully, as if measuring the quiet decision in his voice. Then she gave a single nod and stepped toward the shadowed trail leading deeper into Red Mesa Canyon. The night settled fully over Red Mesa Canyon as Ethan Caldwell guided his horse down the narrow trail behind Ayanna. Above them, the desert sky stretched clear and endless, filled with bright stars that seemed close enough to touch between the tall canyon walls. The air carried a cool stillness now, and every sound echoed softly through the stone corridor. The horse stepped carefully along the winding path while Ayanna moved ahead with quiet confidence, her silhouette steady against the dim silver light of the moon rising over the canyon rim nearly 100 feet above. After several minutes, the trail began to widen, and the towering walls slowly opened until the path emerged onto a high ridge overlooking a hidden valley. Ethan drew the horse to a stop. From that ridge, the land unfolded below them like a quiet secret, preserved by time. The valley stretched nearly half a mile across, surrounded by red cliffs that curved like protective arms around the land. A narrow stream glimmered faintly through the center, reflecting the moonlight as it wound between small clusters of desert cottonwood and tall grasses that moved gently in the night breeze. Ethan let out a slow breath. Now that, he said quietly, is something the maps never mentioned. Ayanna stood beside him, her gaze calm as she looked across the valley floor. Few maps ever reach this place, she said. Ethan studied the land carefully. The grasses looked healthy despite the dry desert surrounding the canyon, and the stream cut a clear path through the soil like a silver ribbon. There must be a spring feeding that water, he said thoughtfully. Ayanna nodded. A deep one. She stepped closer to the ridge edge and pointed toward a group of stone formations near the center of the valley. Even in the moonlight, Ethan could see that the rocks there formed a natural circle around a flat clearing. That is where the healers gathered, she said quietly. Ethan followed her gesture. Your people still come here. Ayanna shook her head slowly. Only when the land calls for it. The wind drifted gently across the ridge, carrying the soft rustling of grasses from the valley floor nearly 200 yards below. Ethan studied the quiet land, and then glanced back toward the narrow canyon path behind them. Somewhere beyond those distant turns, the riders they had heard earlier were still making their way through the desert night. If those men find this valley, he said calmly, they will think they have discovered a fortune. Ayanna looked at him. Because of the water. Ethan nodded. Water in the desert is worth more than silver. Ayanna turned her eyes back toward the stream, reflecting the moonlight below. The valley has never belonged to silver hunters, she said softly. Ethan rested one hand on the saddle horn, thinking carefully about the quiet land before them. The canyon walls surrounding the valley rose nearly 200 feet on every side, forming a natural barrier that kept the outside world at a distance. Then tomorrow morning, he said slowly, those riders are going to need a reason to turn around. Ayanna looked at him with quiet curiosity. And you believe they will listen? Ethan gave a small thoughtful smile. Sometimes men do not listen to words. He looked across the moonlit valley once more. But they usually listen to silence when it stands in their way. The wind moved gently through the grasses again, while the hidden valley of Red Mesa waited quietly beneath the desert stars. Morning arrived slowly over Red Mesa Canyon, the first light of dawn spilling across the high cliffs like pale gold dust settling on ancient stone. Ethan Caldwell stood beside his horse at the ridge overlooking the hidden valley while the cool desert air carried the quiet scent of grass and water rising from the stream below. The valley looked even more peaceful in daylight. The narrow ribbon of water curved through the green land like a living thread, and the cottonwood trees shimmered softly in the gentle breeze. For a moment the place felt untouched by the world beyond the canyon walls. Then the distant sound of horses drifted up from the narrow trail behind them. Ethan lifted his head slightly. The rhythm of hooves echoed through the canyon, slow but steady. Ayanna stood beside him, watching the same trail. They have reached the outer pass, she said calmly. Ethan nodded once. 5 riders. The sound carried clearly now, bouncing between the tall red cliffs nearly 100 feet high on either side of the canyon corridor. Ethan adjusted the brim of his hat and rested one hand loosely against the saddle horn. Ayanna stepped forward until she stood at the center of the narrow ridge path that led down toward the valley. The trail there was barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass side by side. The riders appeared several minutes later as they rounded the final bend in the canyon. 5 men on dusty horses rode cautiously along the rocky path, their silhouettes framed by the rising sunlight behind them. They slowed when they noticed the figures waiting ahead. Ethan stood quietly with his horse beside him while Ayanna remained at the center of the trail. The lead rider brought his horse to a stop about 20 yards away. He studied the narrow path, the canyon walls rising around them, and the calm stillness of the two people standing there. No one reached for a weapon. No one raised their voice. The silence of the canyon seemed to settle between them like an invisible wall. The lead rider finally spoke. "Morning," he said carefully. Ethan tipped his hat once. "Morning." The rider glanced toward the valley beyond the ridge, where the green land and shining stream stretched peacefully below. His eyes lingered there for a moment before returning to Ethan and Ayanna. "We heard there might be silver somewhere in these mesas," he said. Ethan followed the man's gaze toward the valley and then looked back again. "You heard wrong." The rider studied him for several seconds. The quiet wind moved gently through the canyon grasses and the cottonwood leaves far below. Finally, the man looked at Ayanna. She stood calmly in the center of the trail, her posture steady and unafraid, the desert light reflecting softly from the turquoise beads around her neck. The rider's eyes shifted once more toward the valley, then back to the narrow ridge path and the silent canyon walls rising nearly 200 feet around them. Something about the stillness of the place seemed to weigh on his thoughts. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "Looks like we took the wrong trail." He turned his horse carefully in the narrow path, and the other riders followed without another word. The sound of hooves gradually faded back into the canyon behind them until the wind carried only silence again. Ethan watched the trail for a moment before turning back toward the valley below. The sunlight now filled the hidden land with warm color. Ayanna looked at him quietly. "You stayed when you could have left," she said. Ethan touched the turquoise stone resting against his chest and smiled faintly. "Some places deserve someone willing to stay." The wind moved gently through Red Mesa Canyon once more, carrying the quiet understanding that some legends were never meant to be discovered, only protected.